mic. I'm ready to start recording. All right. The last section of this class is, if you will, sort of a peek ahead into other sorts of technologies that are relevant as far as web development goes. We spent really the first portion of the class dealing with really the fundamentals of web development, and I guess I would characterize those fundamentals as HTML, CSS, as well as design, and including in design, or perhaps even saying the most important part of design, being the planning process. Again, a very common myth, I guess I would call it, even when you talk to people that should know better, when you talk about web design, is thinking in terms of nice colors and pretty pictures and that sort of thing. Which, again, I'm not going to discount the fact that you want to have your pages look a certain way. You know, you want them to be visually appealing. You want their look to complement the content that you're having. But really, that is the surface. That's what I like that's one of the things I like about the Jesse James Garrett book. They call that the surface level. All right, which is not to say that it's not important, but it implies that there's other layers more deep and possibly even more fundamental, and that is understanding really the goals of why you're developing the site, and understanding the goals of your visitors, and understanding and trying to put yourself in the shoes of the visitors to determine what kind of stuff you can put on your site to satisfy their needs. So those things, I would say, are the fundamentals. In the last section of the class, we're going to sort of peek ahead to some other things. We're going to talk about form processing, all right, which we'll start on today. We will talk a bit about development for mobile websites, all right, and we will talk about JavaScript. Let me ask you a question. If you were to open Lab 1 that you turned in, all right, if you were to open that today, what would it look like? Well, let me rephrase that. What would it look like compared to how it looked when you turned it in? Well, yeah, it's basic. I mean, I think you're comparing it to the kind of stuff that we're doing now. But let's put it this way: if you took a screenshot of how it looked the day you turned it in, and took a screenshot of how it looked now, how would those two compare?
Even if we were to redo it?
No, not if you're to redo it. If you're to literally download it again and look at it again, it would look exactly the same as when you turned it in. All right. I guess that's my point. All right. HTML and CSS are static, and static, used in this sense, means unchanging. The opposite of static is dynamic, and dynamic relates to changing. And dynamic is where forms come into, because form data is one of the key parts of dynamic websites. All right, let's talk about. Well, let's look at a couple of dynamic websites and talk a bit about them, and specifically those that use forms. If we were to go to Google, all right, let's go to regular old Google, and let's say I wanted to find a Greek restaurant in the area. It's funny, when I was a little kid, I was like the world's pickiest eater, and I think at some point the tipping point hit, and now I am hungry and want to eat all the time. All right? I don't know how that happened, but anyhow, I'm already thinking about lunch, and I was thinking maybe some Greek food would be good. So if I were to go and type in Google, Greek restaurant, notice a couple things that are happening. First of all, notice that amazingly enough, the few things that they're showing me right here are things that are like generally in the area. All right? They're not showing me restaurants in Athens. All right? They're not even showing me restaurants in New York City. At least not yet. They're showing me restaurants in Lakewood, restaurants in Cleveland, restaurants that are nearby. That's curious. You know, if you were in New York City and you typed in Greek restaurant, do you suppose you'd see a list of restaurants in Lakewood? Probably not, right? You would see a list of restaurants in New York. So I do a search, and it will show me, again, a list of Greek restaurants in the Elyria, Ohio area. It actually did a little better than that even. All right? And then down here it shows me some other ones. All right? In different places. Let's say I change my mind and I'm thinking of Italian restaurants. Again, notice what it shows me. It shows me things that are generally in the area. All right, Presti's of Oberlin and all that. And in addition, it shows me Italian restaurants instead of Greek restaurants. That's hard to explain when we talk just in terms of HTML, right? Because as we noted, with HTML, if you were to look at a page today versus look at the page, you know, when you turned it in, it's going to look identical. Here we have a case of a page that doesn't look identical. It looks different every time we type something in, all right? It changes. And again, the term that we use for that is a dynamic web page. And again, how is it dynamic? This is actually dynamic a couple different ways. One is it's dynamic based on what I've entered into the form. All right? So if I type Italian restaurant in the form, I get a list of Italian restaurants. If I type Greek restaurant, I get a list of Greek restaurants. It's also dynamic based on where my location is. Right? It pulled up restaurants in our area. All right? And that's not an amazing coincidence. You know, if we went somewhere else, it would pull up restaurants in that area. My brother in New York City did a search. He would get Greek restaurants in New York. All right? And if someone in California did a search, they'd get their restaurants there. So, it's dynamic two ways. It's dynamic based on the data that I enter in the form. It's dynamic in terms of it knows where I'm located, at least approximately, and it gives me search results tailored to that. It's actually dynamic a third way as well, insofar as if there was a new Greek restaurant that opened today, let's say, and I did a search, by the end of the week, that restaurant, you know, let's say the restaurant opens and comes out with a website. I would think very shortly, within a few days, if even that restaurant would start appearing in my search as I search for Greek restaurants near Elyria, Ohio, if a new one opened down the street and created a website. So it's dynamic also based on the stuff that's in Google's database, the stuff of all the websites that get indexed by Google. Let's look at another dynamic website that uses form data. And it's one you all should be familiar about, Angel. I go in and type my username and password in. Yep. I go in and type my username and password in. And notice what I get. I get a list of my courses that I'm teaching this fall. I also get notifications if someone, if there's stuff that needs to be graded. That's what this little icon means. If someone has posted to a discussion forum, or if someone has sent me an email. All right? So, this page is dynamic a couple different ways, right? Because if I were to log off and ask you to log on, all right, you wouldn't see my courses here, right? You would see your courses. This is so it's dynamic based on the data that was entered into the form. In other words, who I logged on as. It's dynamic also based on things that have been sent to me recently. The fact that there's an email icon here, that's not there all the time. It's not there for this class. It's there for this class, though. What does that mean? That means that someone has sent me an email in that class that I have not read. So I get an unread notification. So again, there's something in Angel's database that says, hey, there's an email that I haven't read. It's dynamic another different way as well. I guess we could consider this a different way. If I click on this course, all right, content, I have a link, I was going to say a button, but I have a link to add content or delete content if I want to. Your page looks different than that, right? Your page, you might have these links here, but you don't have the ability to update them or change them or whatever. Likewise, the Dropbox, you don't have the ability to go into the Dropbox and grade stuff. All right? So, it's dynamic based on information that Angel has about us. Namely, what courses we're in, what semester we're in, right, because I brought up that semester, and what role that we're playing in this class. In other words, if I were to be taking a class here, as well as teaching, in that class I wouldn't be able to go and grade stuff, but in the classes I teach I am able to. So, none of this could be accomplished just with HTML. Yet, if we look, let's go and do another Google search real quick. Let's look for Polish restaurants. Yet if we look at the results that it gave me, and I go and do a view source, even though it's hard to read, it's giving me HTML back. So these web pages, believe it or not, even though they're constructed in a dynamic fashion, they're still comprised of HTML and CSS, the stuff that we learned. All right? So how does this work? Clearly HTML and CSS aren't enough to do this, yet these pages are in HTML and CSS. If we looked at Angel, we would see the same thing. All right. Here's how it works. The kind of web pages that we've developed, static web pages, work like this. We have a client, and by the client, I mean someone sitting in front of their computer working on a browser. All right? Or it could be someone with a mobile device. Right? That's a client as well. In these terms, a client is a system that is making requests for web pages. They are connected to the internet, which again is drawn as a cloud because we don't necessarily know all the details. All right, that's a networking question. How does this request that I type in get from point A to point B? All right, it hits a lot of points in between. All right, and we're not, for the purposes of this class, we're not terribly interested in the path that it takes, but it actually bounces all around the internet from computer to computer until finally it makes it to the server that I'm interested in. We don't really care about the path that it takes. We're more than happy to represent that as a cloud.
Millions, billions?
No, not millions or billions.
Thousands?
No, 7 or 8, okay. Maybe. You could actually look. We could actually look and see this. Probably. Let's see if there's a. Yeah, what the heck. Let's do a trace to see how it gets from here to Google. All right. It looks like it made 14 hops, which you can't see. There's a tool where I said do a trace to trace how it got to this site. And if I click on trace, it shows me actually shows me 14 hops. So in this drawing, there'd be 14 little line segments to go from there to there. And that's probably typical. But that's how it gets routed through the internet. All right. At any rate, the bottom line is I make a request to the client. It somehow makes it through the internet, hits the server. In the case of a static HTML page, the web pages are out there and ready to be delivered. So all the server does is grab them and send them. And then, by the same token, it makes its way back to me. All right? So in the case of static pages, the server has a real easy job. All the server does is takes the finished page, along with the other files, the image files, the CSS files, all the files associated with the web page, and they're already finished, they deliver them. The analogy I give in a lot of my classes is like going into McDonald's. You go into McDonald's, all right, and order a Big Mac and fries, let's say, all right. They just grab the Big Mac that's already been made, grab the fries that's already been bagged, put it in a bag, and give it to you, all right. They don't start cooking it at that point when you order it, all right. They just take, what's already been prepared and deliver it to you. And that's exactly how static pages work, all right. The problem with that, of course, is that's sort of a one-size-fits-all mentality, right? In other words, if you order a Big Mac and I'd order a Big Mac, you're going to get the same thing, right? Accounting for slight differences, in the individual sandwiches. But for the most part, we're getting the exact same thing. That's more like a static web page, where every time you request it, you get the same thing. Now, what happens in the case of a dynamic web page? In the case of dynamic web pages, the pages aren't finished. The server doesn't have pre-written web pages to be delivered. The server works more like an employee at Subway restaurants, right? If you go into Subway and you order what's one of their sandwiches? BMT. All right? So you go there and order a BMT. What are they going to ask you? They're going to ask you what kind of bread you want, what kind of cheese you want, do you want it toasted or not? Do you want, what kind of toppings, what kind of veggies do you want on it? Do you want a sauce on it or not? And so on. So let's think to all the components that go into that. All right? First of all, the server has in their mind a recipe of how to make that sandwich. They know the instructions of how to make it. A BMT has certain ingredients that come with it when you order it. The server also asks you some questions, you, the client, some questions that you supply answers to, and they use, along with the recipe and the ingredients, they also have a base of ingredients. So they take the recipe, the ingredients, and your feedback and piece it together to make a sandwich just for you, and they deliver it to you. So your BMT isn't going to look like my BMT. Your Big Mac looked exactly like my Big Mac, but my BMT won't look, because I'm liable to answer different questions, right? or answer the questions differently, rather. All right. So, how does that relate to dynamic web pages? Well, the server does not have completed HTML pages. The server has what are called server-side scripts. All right. And what are server-side scripts? Think of them as recipes for creating a web page. They're the instructions to create a web page. The server also interacts with form data. And this is like, in Subway, the questions that you get asked. These are answers that the client supplies. In Angel, you supply the answer to the question, what's your username and password? In Google, you supply the answer to the question, what is it that you're searching for? If you go to advanced search, you supply a whole bunch of other answers to questions. All right? Those are represented in forms in HTML. So the HTML code here will have forms that will allow you to answer questions. And these answers get sent to the server along with your request. Finally, the server interacts with a database. I suppose you could think of a database as being like the bin of ingredients that they have at a Subway, right? Where there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can choose, and based on what recipe they're following, and based on your input, your answers to the questions, they grab different stuff from that big bin of ingredients and piece it together in some way. Now, interesting point. All right? If you go into McDonald's or you go into Subway, what do you come out with? A sandwich. Right? You can't eat a recipe. Right? You come out with a sandwich in both cases. So, regardless if that sandwich was prepared in advance and sitting there waiting for someone to order it, or the sandwich is created based on your distinct, unique request, when the day is done and you pay and you leave that restaurant, you have a sandwich. It works similarly with these web pages because regardless of whether this process is followed or this process, what gets delivered to the client is HTML and CSS. Why? Because that's what browsers get. That's what browsers understand. You know, that's what browsers want. Browsers want HTML pages. They can handle HTML pages. When you go to a restaurant for lunch, you want a sandwich. So it wouldn't do any good for the web server to give the browser a script. The browser doesn't know what to do with the script. Just like if you went in and ordered a BMT and they handed you a sheet of paper that had the recipe for a BMT, that ain't going to do you any good. All right? You're still going to leave hungry. All right? You need the completed sandwich, all right? And a web browser needs a completed web page. So regardless of whether they're static pages that don't change at all, or they're produced by this process, what gets delivered to the browser is HTML and CSS. Now, how does this fit into this class? There's a piece of this that we're going to learn in this class, and there's a piece of this that we're not going to learn in this class. Okay? We will learn how to create forms in HTML to supply answers to the web server. Answers to the questions that the web server needs to know to do its job. All right? So we will study the HTML to create those forms. What we're not going to be studying in this class is the scripts that process those forms and make HTML. All right? Those we're going to use from someone else. We're going to use scripts that have already been written. For example, for your next homework assignment, you will use a script that I wrote that runs on a web server here. All right? For the examples in class, we'll use a number of other web server scripts, including, probably we'll spend most of the time using Google and their server script to produce that. In other words, our form will submit to a Google script, and the Google script will produce the HTML page and send it back to us. Okay? But first thing we have to do is we have to understand how to create these forms in HTML. And that's where we're going to start. Question? Okay. Forms in HTML. All right. Forms in HTML are the means by which users can enter input to a website. Can answer questions, if you will. All right, that the website needs to know to do its job. For example, you go to Angel. Well, Angel needs to know who you are. Therefore, there's a form for you to put a user ID and a password. All right. You go to Google and want to search for something. There's a form for you to put in the word you want to search for, and you go. Any of you have Google Mail or Yahoo Mail or Hotmail. You want to send an email. There's a box for the email address, right, that you put in who you're sending it to. There's a box for the CC. There's a box for the subject line. There's a box for a bigger box for the body of the message. Then you click submit, and it goes. The server goes and does its thing with that data. Web servers do a lot of things with the data. In the case of Google, it searches their database and returns results that match what you typed in. In the case of an email application, it will take what you've entered into that form and send an email that contains those values. Based on your user ID and password, it brings up your classes in Angel. All right? Based on a bid that you type in eBay, it will go and it will make you, if you've bid higher than the current bid, it will make you the new top bidder on eBay, and so on. What are some ways that data is entered onto a form? In other words, the first simplest way is what's called a text box. And a text box is simply something that looks like this. That you can go and you can enter your username in. For example, we go to Angel. That is what a text box is. It's a box for you to enter data in. There's actually two other form controls on this page besides the text box. What are the two other form controls? Buttons. All right. There's actually a couple kinds of buttons. For now, we'll talk about the submit button. And a submit button is what takes the data and sends it to the server for processing. There's a couple other kinds of buttons, but we won't talk about them now. The submit button is sort of the main button when we talk about forms, because it's what actually gets the ball rolling and sends the data to the web server to be processed. This one might be a bit of a trick question. What's another form control that we see on this page besides a text box and a button? Okay, there is a checkbox, but there's not a checkbox on this page.
And those radio buttons?
Is what radio?
Binocular and the question mark and
Oh, no. No. Pardon me? The links, those aren't really form controls. I guess what I'm getting at is a password. Because notice a password behaves differently than the regular text box. So that's actually a different form control. All right. The username, what you type in appears there. That's an ordinary text box. The password control, your input is masked. All right. So that would be another. That'd be another form control. All right, I heard a couple other things mentioned. One is a checkbox. What does a checkbox allow you to do? Select what? Okay. How is it different than a text box?
either on or off, right? You
Right.
select it or you don't.
Right. A checkbox is a control that only has two possibilities, checked or not checked. So a checkbox is good for yes or no questions. So probably the most common one that you'll see is, do you agree with the terms and conditions of this website? You check yes, or you leave it unchecked for no. And if you leave it unchecked, then it knows not to process your form, because you have to agree for it to register on the site or whatever. All right? But yeah, that's what I'm getting at. A checkbox is a yes or no option only, as opposed to a text box where I put in, a name. And that name could be any name. We're not limited to yes or no. So, part of designing a form is coming up with the right form controls. So, some of them are obvious, some of them are maybe not so obvious, and some of them you might actually have a couple different options on how to do it, and really it depends on other issues. Let's say, for example, out of these 4 controls, if we were having a pizza delivery place and we wanted to know if the order should be delivered or not, all right, which one would we use? Checkbox, right? Because we could say like this, we could have our checkbox on the page that would say delivery, and there'd be a checkbox, and it would either be checked for yes, we want it delivered, or unchecked if no, we didn't. All right?
Well, with checkboxes, you can have several.
Mm-hmm.
Check them all. But radio buttons, I think you would only pick one. Right?
Okay, we'll talk. Yeah, the question was raised about the difference between checkboxes and radio buttons, and we'll come to those. Each checkbox is independent of the other ones. So, for example, if there was what would be another example?
That's what made me think of it. If you put a pickup one, they could literally select both of them.
Yeah, which is why you wouldn't have a pickup and delivery checkbox, because they could pick both of them. But I could have delivery, a checkbox, and what would be another one? I'm trying to continue with the pizza example. Well, the ingredients, yeah. Pizza toppings. Yeah, that's a good one. You could have a list of toppings. And a series of checkboxes. And what you choose for pepperoni has no impact on whether you want mushrooms or onions. You could want all 3 of them. You could want none of them. So these checkboxes, the idea is they work independent. They're a series of independent, not mutually exclusive yes or no questions for a checkbox. Now you wouldn't want delivery in a text box. Why? Because one person might type in yes for delivery. Another person might type in yep. Another person might type in, yeah, okay. What do those mean? It'd be hard to tell, right? Especially if you're writing a computer program that's going to say process and show only those people that want deliveries on a separate screen, let's say. All right? So therefore, if you want to limit what the user enters, then the checkbox is better than the text box. If you can limit it to a yes or no question, then you can use a checkbox. Now, another one was mentioned, and that is a radio button. Now, the difference between radio buttons and checkboxes is radio buttons are mutually exclusive. You define radio buttons as groups of radio buttons, and within each group, it's mutually exclusive. So, for example, you could have crust on your pizza, and the choice could be thin, thick, or stuffed. Your crust can't both be thin and thick and stuffed at the same time, right? It's thin, or it's thick, or it's stuffed. So it wouldn't be a good idea to use checkboxes here, because then I could check, yeah, I want it thick, and I also want it thin. And by the way, I want it stuffed. That doesn't make any sense. So we could use radio buttons. Radio buttons work just like the radio buttons in your car. In other words, the radio buttons in your car, if you're listening to a station, click another button, that old station goes away, and the new station plays. So you can only play one station at a time in your car. You can only pick one out of a radio button group. Now, the question was raised about delivery. All right? We could actually handle delivery a couple different ways, right? Let me show you a couple ways that we could handle delivery and a couple ways that we wouldn't want to handle delivery. One option for delivery is I could have a delivery checkbox, with the assumption is that check means delivery, not check means not delivery or pickup. I could do the same thing with a set of radio buttons grouped together. All right? And if I pick delivery, pickup would be unchecked. If I check pickup, delivery would be unchecked. So either of these two are okay solutions. All right? They're reasonable. What you wouldn't want to do is have two checkboxes, because then the user could check that they're both. All right? That they are both delivery and pickup, which clearly can't be. You also wouldn't want to have two separate radio button groups, one for delivery and one for pickup, because then, again, you could select both of them. We'll talk a little bit about radio button groups later on, but just suffice it to say that you can have more than one radio button group, but for each radio button group, there can only be one selection. I could, for example, have one for crust, thick, thin. I could have my delivery radio buttons and my crust radio buttons, and each one of these would work as a radio button group. So I could pick thin crust and delivery, and when I pick delivery, it wouldn't get rid of thin crust. All right, so it's not literally all your radio buttons. It's each radio button group can only have one selection. So, again, there's some good ways to do this. There's a couple options for doing this. And there might even be a third option to do this instead of a radio button or checkbox. What's another way that we can limit the list of items that a user can select from? A drop-down list. And a drop-down list will show, again, We could create one that would show the 3 values, and the user could pick the one. By default, the drop-down works like radio buttons, in such that it can only have one value at a time. That actually can be configured. All right, you can actually allow your drop-downs to have more than one value, in which case then they act sort of more like a selection of checkboxes. But typically people are used to seeing drop-downs working like radio buttons, so I generally limit myself to just using them in that mode. All right. So now we have a third way that we could handle delivery, right? We could handle delivery with a checkbox, delivery yes or no. We could handle it with radio buttons, delivery or pickup, or we could handle it with a drop-down where there was 2 options, delivery and pickup. Could we handle crust with a checkbox? No. Why not? Because you could select each checkbox independently, which would allow us to say we want a pizza that's both thin and thick crust, which we couldn't do. Could we use radio buttons for crust? Sure. Could we use a drop-down for crust? Sure. So you have some choices. All right? What are some of the things that might guide you into thinking what choice that you're going to make? In other words, let's get back to the delivery. What might make you decide whether to use a checkbox or a radio button or a drop-down?
I think I would use a radio button because there's only 2 choices, and you have to pick one because they need to know what you're doing.
Okay.
So you can put an editor on there to make sure one is picked. If you were using a Dropbox for that, you have one of its default. You might decide to pick up their default. You want your people running out, your pieces that people are
right.
running up. But if they don't notice that or whatever, they might just skip over it.
Yeah. Okay. The statement was that with radio buttons you could validate to make sure that the user picked one of the 2 options. You actually could do that with a drop-down as well by putting a 3rd dummy option at the top that says please select one. But again, that sort of muddies the water a little bit. All right. So that's a possibility. Why not use a checkbox?
Either pick up or deliver.
Right, but it's either delivery yes or no.
I think it's ambiguous because
Okay.
if it's left blank, you don't know if they really want to pick it up or not.
Okay.
You might have just skipped over it.
Okay. So you want to force them to choose. All right. And that's a decent way to look at it. It's a decent analysis. I guess some of the factors that would influence my decision of whether I was going to doing it is, first of all, whether the alternative is clear to the user. In other words, if it's not delivery, what is it? Well, we know that it's pickup, right? But is every user going to understand that that means pickup? You know, maybe, maybe not. All right. Another thing is simply a space issue on the screen. A checkbox and a checkbox and a drop-down is going to take up less physical space on the screen than radio buttons would. All right. Radio buttons have the advantage, however, of showing you all the alternatives all in one shot. All right. So if I use delivery or pickup as radio buttons, I could see, bang, those are the 2 options. If there's a 3rd option to dine in, let's say, then bang, I could see all 3 of the options. They're all laid out in front of me. But they're going to take up more space, right? So I guess, are all the alternatives clear? And is there screen space would help me determine which one to do. So if it's a yes-no question, if it's clear what the checked and unchecked means, like, for example, I agree with terms and conditions, it's clear that the opposite of that is I don't agree with those. And we want them to agree before they move forward, so yes, we can deliberately force them to check that. But you make a good point about pickup and delivery. They could have just omitted that. All right, and we're going to assume that they mean pickup, where maybe they were just lazy and didn't see that. All right. The point is you should develop your forms deliberately after thinking through. If there was a form, let's say a different form, that had state as an option, radio buttons for state probably wouldn't be a good idea because that would simply take up too much screen real estate. However, a drop-down would probably work pretty good. All right? So all those factors come into play in deciding what form controls you're going to use. There are a couple more form controls. There's different kinds of buttons that we're not going to talk about, at least right now. We'll probably come back to those at some point. One of them is the dreaded clear button that there's an article in Angel about. Don't use it. That's why I'm really not talking about it that much. There's also just a plain button that we'll hit on when we talk about JavaScript. The other form control, I think it's the only other one that we haven't mentioned, is what's called a text area. And a text area would be a big field like this. That's to distinguish from a text box, which is simply a single line. So text area is multiple lines, text box is one line. What we're going to do today to finish up class is going to introduce you to some of these tags, as many as we can fit in over the next 5 minutes. All right. What we'll do next time is we'll talk about hooking up this form to the server-side script. All right. So let's go in and let's make a form. So here we go. I have the start of an HTML. First tag that we have is a form tag. I'm going to leave some space here because there's a couple of attributes that the form tag needs that we're not going to talk about right today. We'll talk about those on Wednesday. But I'm going to leave some space so I can fill that in on Wednesday. And likewise, there'll be an end form tag. The form tag goes around all the values that we want to be sent to the server as a package. You can think of the form tag as sort of like the envelope that's going to contain everything that we're going to send to the server. So for example, in the case of Angel, where we have a user ID, a password, and a submit button, all three of those things are within the form tag in Angel. All right. It's possible to have it's possible to have a web page that contains two forms, but that isn't real common. All right. You have them. I guess it's not all that rare either, but probably the more common case is that if a page has a form, it will only have one. Where you might have a page with two forms might be, here's the section of the page if you're going to register for a new account. Here's the section of page if you already have an account and log on. Right? That's two logically different things. If I'm creating a new account, there's a whole bunch of data that I need to send to the server. My name, my user ID, my password, and so on. If I'm logging on already, if I already have an account, I don't need to supply all that again. I simply need to give my user ID and password. So that's one case where a page might have two forms because there's two sort of logical groups of data that I might want to send to the server. So at any rate, I have my form tag. The first thing that we'll look for will be a text box. And a text box is an input tag with a type equals text. And I'm going to give it a name as well. All right. The input tag is actually used for several of these form controls. It's used for buttons. It's used for checkboxes. It's used for radio buttons. All right. And there's just a different type for each of them. So, that's a text box, and I give it a name. I give it a name because the server needs to know what piece of data is what. All right? If you're logging on to Angel and you're supplying a user ID and password, Angel needs to know which one the user ID is, which one the password is. So the text boxes are given names to indicate what is what. The last tag that we'll look at today will be an input with the type equals submit. So, it's an input tag just like the text box is, but it has a different type. Instead of a type of text, it has a type of submit. The value is what's going to appear on the button. And the name, again, is the name of the button, so we know exactly what happened. There could be a form with two buttons on it, right? Two submit buttons. You know, change or delete this record. If we're going to look at this then, I'm going to go save it, and I'll go view it in the browser. There we have our text box. All right. And there we have our submit button. And again, the text that appears in it is go, because that's the value we gave. Now, if I click search, notice it doesn't do anything. We haven't wired this. We haven't hooked this up to a server-side script to process this request. We've just collected the data in a form. All right? That's what we'll pick up next time. Next time, we'll hook this guy up to a script. You could actually practice this on your own if you want. If you go to Angel, and read this article, on the Resources tab, adding Google search to a site. We'll work through that next time. But that'll show you how to hook up a form to a server-side script. And that's what we'll do next time for our example. All right, we'll see you over in lab.